Who knows what a dingler is? It was a profession. No, I want to know who knows. I know.
A doctor who would give women hysterectomies.
Say it again.
A doctor who would give women hysterectomies.
Very close.
No hysterectomies, though.
Get them off.
It was a doctor who would use pretty much a box like that to create electric currents inside pretty much glass dildos and would cure hysteria by giving women orgasms.
You were very close. This stupid little machine here made a bunch of dinglers unemployed. Because, you are right, the dingler's job, he was a medical profession. I have not been able to find how you got trained to be said dingler. And it was always men would cure women of a variety of illnesses or symptoms. The most common being female hysteria. Female hysteria was represented by such things as thinking your husband drinks too much, wanting to spend money on food for your children, a whole variety of symptoms I think we would all recognize today as classic signs of female hysteria. You would go to the dingler, you would go to the doctor who would make this diagnosis, and then you would go to the dingler, sometimes once a week, once a month, depending on how severe, because it was considered a fatal disease. So your
husband, I hope.
Huh?
For the husband, I hope.
So it was, if they spent too much time with the dingler, I imagine. So the dingler would physically manipulate yours to relieve you of the pressure that
those crazy ideas.
But then, unfortunately today, none of us can be dinglers because of this machine. This machine is called the Hess machine. This is an actual 1920. They were first started in 1890. There's great pictures of these old ones with the giant crank. I guess that's what the dingler did when he no longer could dingle, I would imagine is the verb.
He was replaced by a crank.
It's good work if you can get it.
We also, by the way, for people who can't see it well during as we example it now, we will also be showing it off later. We actually have it at our table if you're willing to. Anyway, but so people can't see now.
That did not come out right.
No, we're not going to
Don't
be
everyone rush
performing those
forward
services.
So we will take a single volunteer. We will show the Hess machine.
I think we really have to pick this person who's tried to volunteer.
I believe so. Bring her on up.
All right. Yes.
Matilda's going to act.
Be a little
It's a liberated era.
It's a liberated era. Fringe
Not just
dingler.
men can be dinglers.
I will give you the history. This is an actual this particular version is 1920s.
Well, you got the wrong attachment anyway.
Yes, we have the wrong
The
attachment.
other attachment's there.
But the actual attachment is there. So they would go door to door, curing a variety of things, from migraines. This one was for TB. There was one for constipation. Yeah. But the big money item was always female hysteria, and that was 50 cents. Constipation was like a dime. Okay. What's going to happen here, if all goes well, and I've been insured by the organizers, they have plenty of insurance to cover this. Did we forget to ask that? Oh well. Turn it up for a second. Let me explain it. So, Matilda's hair was black earlier today. Okay, so what's going to happen very quickly is this is a Tesla coil. I assume you all know what a Tesla coil is. It's the original one. It's going to produce 110 volts here. It's going to cross here. It's going to go across this arm. It's going to jump this span, and then it's going to be about 110,000 volts. Do not touch anything over here. It's going to run down here. It's going to glow purple, and it's going to do its dingling best. Imagine that placed somewhere other than your hand.
Like my arm?
Yes, like your arm.
Joey, like your arm.
And that was 50 cents. We're going to take questions now.
Everybody get back. Get back, you animals. Who has a question?
Is that kind of like a toilet?
It is. It's used today by kinksters. I assume you read about it somewhere.
I read about it.
Yes, yes.
Because if you were, you should actually be ashamed. Yeah.
No, it's awesome.
Oh, okay.
I will go ahead.
They wouldn't have used these particular, these are the original attachments, but they wouldn't have used these because in the 1920s, all of this is electrical still. So you would have to be very, very careful. Any other questions? Oh, well,
You in the back.
You were talking about how bad our education was. What would you recommend like young teenagers in middle school and high school learn as opposed to what they learn now?
I would suggest they buy the book.
After October 15th, I would suggest they buy the book. And I would also say that there's a lot of information that's starting to come out in different communities just about, like, for example, introduction to consent. And introduction to the idea that it's not just the lack of a no, but the presence of a yes. Whether or not that yes is verbal or something that you all have agreed upon as a sign that things are okay. The idea is that, you know, people need to be aware and consenting at all times. And there are people who push consent culture. There are actually groups, I'm only aware of some in North Carolina specifically, that go around to colleges and do these presentations and do like actual what should be sex ed, where people like learn about how to, and it sounds horrible, how to not rape people. Or how to not harass people.
Yeah.
But like, no, it's not saying, yeah, exactly. We're not teaching people how not to get, exactly. If you want to say that again loudly, or.
Why do we teach people how to not get raped? Why don't we teach people not to rape?
Yeah. Exactly. And anytime that you have youth culture mixed with alcohol, and you have people who just aren't actually necessarily educated in what's going on, you have a lot of stuff that's really not okay. You have a lot of stuff that is okay, but that's the kind of thing that people need to be taught about. I have a decent number of information. There's like a lot of zines and stuff around. I'm sure there's also books about it, but I'm not too aware. I'm mostly aware of a lot of the zines around consent. But that is something we actually want a Steampunk's Guide to Sex to be, among other things, an actual guide to sex. And of course, there's also stuff not just about consent, that people need to understand more about alternative sexualities. And again, that sort of information just isn't really provided to us. I'm sure a lot of it exists on the internet, and there's also a lot of really, really wrong ideas on the internet. And so I actually don't know a specific good collection of it.
And I want to say too, because we didn't cover, because we only had a certain amount of time, we had a lot of fun, but in the book there will be a large section, because the Victorians also had, just as they had a very weird idea about sex, they also had a very weird idea about gender, and you had great GLBT heroes coming out of the Victorian age, like Oscar Wilde and things like that, but you also had a lot of repression, and we go into all that too. So I want to say that there's a lot of queer stuff also that will be in the book, which I think is equally as important. Yes. No, I said I'd do you next. That did not come
I was just thinking, like you were mentioning, like there is now steampunk, erotica out there. How does that actually differ from like authentic Victorian erotica?
Well, a lot of it is coming, I mean...
There's gears in it.
Yeah, well, yeah. They all wear goggles, apparently. It's very important. But honestly, the stuff that happens in the Victorian porn might actually need goggles more in the end. It's basically just a steampunk-affected contemporary erotica. Most of it is just like, people who are contemporary erotica writers who also write steampunk. I haven't personally read too much, and also, I mean, a lot of steampunk writers are guilty, like myself, of often using like affectatious language and things like that, and trying to like mimic older styles of writing. And so some of that exists, but by and large, it's contemporary erotica painted brass.
I'm losing track of who raised their hand. There was somebody over here?
Yeah,
yeah, I'm sorry, you. I got you next.
So, I'm just curious, what do you think, like, when should we start sex education? Because I know my health teacher, in, like, junior year, somehow managed to land the job. He was great. He totally taught me all this stuff. Because we started sex ed in 5th grade, and I didn't really start learning about it until I was 17. So when should we start? Do we have 7-year-olds knowing where babies come from, or like it's kind of a messy topic?
I'm not, I mean, schools are perhaps not the best place for it. I think things like this, and that's why I was kind of sad that we couldn't have younger folks in here. We would have changed up the language, of course, a little. But, I mean, in groups that have natural affinity, our communities should be the places that we're doing it. We're not educators, none of us up here, despite being a professor. There's quotations around that. You just can't see it. But I don't know, what do you think?
There they are, there are the quotations.
Thank you. What do you think, Matilda?
I don't know.
Yeah, I honestly think that a lot of that is up to communities and families to decide. And I actually think in some ways schools are unfortunately the closest thing that people have to these communities in an alienated culture. So I actually think sex education. But this turns into sort of a political discussion that I don't
Are you
necessarily want to take
keeping
it into.
stack? Because we had
Okay.
a question there,
Yeah.
and then here, and then here, and there.
Okay.
I was curious, how is asexuality perceived in the brain?
I actually don't specifically know.
Asexuality, it depends on, if it was voluntary asexuality, it was considered in high regard. The idea that you would resist the temptation even to the point of procreation, which was something they wanted. And if you read fiction from the Victorian era, there's an awful lot about artificial insemination. Why? Is because they wanted to be able to reproduce certain ones without sex.
Without the messy.
As far as asexual identity, I have not been able to find much. I've been able to find a lot on, trans and queer, but as far as asexual identity, I have not been able to find much. So it's probably out there, but it may be lost.
If anyone finds out, let us know while we're still writing this book.
Yeah, just a real quick question. I think it's great that you are talking about opening these ideas up to a younger culture, and so you don't wake up in your teens and you say, what the hell is all this? Isn't there a chance, though, that teaching young kids about sex ed with a electric dildo might be off-putting?
Well, I don't think we would suggest necessarily having, we're part of a community here, even though it's we knew this was going to be 18 or older, but if they had not been 18 or older, we would have changed the presentation, and I'm sure the questions would have changed. And I think that's normal. I don't think that it shouldn't be a place for adults to laugh and explore these kind of things, but I think there also needs to be an equally important place for just talking, and it's not just sex. You can't remove sex from things like gender and relationships and how we treat each other. In intimacy, and we need to have spaces where that's done, because we go to a lot of conferences and we hear stories about people feeling not safe, people acting creepy around them, and things like that, and that's, none of us want that. We want everybody to feel safe, and we don't have those. There'll be I did a panel on cons, he did like 8 panels, we did a panel on the apocalypse, we're doing a panel on sex, but there really isn't a panel on how not to be creepy.
There was one, wasn't there?
Oh, there was
one. I just heard about it, and that's pretty cool.
That is excellent.
The panel I was at just before this was actually, it was like everyone sharing their convention stories, and more than one younger woman expressed their like, oh yeah, I have a really interesting convention story. I got creeped on really hard in the following ways for like 3 days. Shit like that. And that happened more than once in this like small room.
But it wasn't billed as...
No, sorry, that was not but there was a How Not to Be a Creep panel that I think is awesome that happened.
How to talk to girls.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
Well,
Very
that's
close.
the same, you know.
Okay.
That was
Don't stare at the
So, we need more of those, and I don't think you're too young to go to one of those. You may be bored, but you may not be too.
I had a hand back there. Oh, you were on SAC? Okay.
I went to a human sexual behavior course in my undergraduate, and one of the things that I think was an interesting point that my professor raised about sexual education was the fact that it can start whenever, and it can be related to a person's developmental state. Like a kid, a small child can learn, babies grow in mom's tummy. That's a form of sexual education. They don't have to get all biological about it.
No 2-page diagrams?
Not yet.
In France, they have pinball machines that are sperm trying to
Do you have his next one stuck? I think we're ready for that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, your turn.
I want that pinball machine.
Actually, I was curious about I know you had mentioned that you had sort of researched a lot on queer and trans identities. I guess I'm wondering what trans communities and non-binary communities would look like in the Victorian era in a society that was very binarist and very often
Well,
sort of biologically essential.
go ahead, I'll chime in.
Two things. One is, I have to be clear, not all the research was done by the three of us up here. There are other people that aren't here that did different research. But to answer your question, very interesting. There was a neighborhood, for example, in New York. This is around 1860 to 1870. So this is, to put that, for those of you that aren't good in dates, this is around the time of the Civil War, okay? So that gives you kind of and it's in the Lower East Side, and it was the first that I could find of a trans community that was in Greenwich Village at the time, which was mostly, for those of you who don't know New York history, mostly made up of people of color. So you have a people of color, transgender, small community on basically 2 blocks, but it was very well known and actually well respected. And you had very interesting people that would go. And what did that look like? As far as I can tell from the memoirs of people who went there as opposed to the people that lived there, it's very different, I think. And I have not been able to find any memoirs yet of people that lived there, is that there was this idea that a lot of fluidity in gender. And one of the things they had that I thought was very, very interesting is they had this thing called spot dancing, which was that you would tap somebody and you would do a version of a rock, paper, scissors, and that would determine if you were going to be the male or the female, or just kind of create this binary. But it could change, and you would play this game, and I want to find the details of this game. So it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to always be the person leading the dance. It may switch in the dance itself. So the best answer I could give was a lot of fluidity, a lot of playing around with clothes and things like that. But you had that even in the non-transgender world, the changing the trousers being worn by women. You have this going back, predates Victorian, with people like George Eliot and those people. But there was this idea of freedom in exploring gender. This was not widespread, and I don't think it was a coincidence. It happened primarily in poor neighborhoods and primarily in neighborhoods made up of people of color, because they were already marginalized and they were in some ways freer to kind of reject the normal Victorian way. But I think there's a lot. If I were doing some very serious research, I think this would be an area that I'm hoping somebody is going to do someday very soon, because I think it's going to be very interesting.
That
Absolutely. You have a number of great bars. Some of that is mentioned in the book. Lots of other people have written extensively on that, or this mixture of poetry, artists, you know.
Well, the other part about specifically non-heterosexual culture is that Victorian society was so, especially the upper society, was so gender segregated that women spend most of their time with other women and men spend most of their time with other men. So a lot of the what would be considered inappropriate relationships were happening within those you know, normal relationships and covertly, and of course we've read a lot about those.
And homosexuality is a little bit like sex work, where it was considered something that many people engaged in part of the time. The real problem was when you did it all the time or became your identity.
There's also this idea that I've only been reading a little bit about recently, that the idea of heterosexuality is kind of a recent invention. The idea of being straight is like 200 years old, at least in Western culture. And, you know, and it wasn't that there like weren't straight people before that, but that instead just, yeah, this idea that you like, this is, like they were saying, like this is the only thing that's okay. And also, are people familiar with this, this woman, Isabel Eberhardt? There's this woman who spent most of her adult life, she lived a very short life, she wrote a lot of fiction. She's kind of one of my steampunk heroes in some ways, and there's a whole long article about her in Steampunk Magazine, some of the earlier issues that someone wrote. And her whole thing is that she dressed as a man and she dressed around and traveled around Northern Africa and wrote. And she just like was like, yeah, I'm a man. And the thing is that like a lot of the stuff that talks about it sort of implies that she passes, but then a lot of the more recent stuff is basically saying she didn't pass as a man. She was just like, yo, I'm a dude. And people are like, all right, whatever, dude. And like, and I'm sure she faced gender oppression, but like, by and large, it was a society, in some circumstances at least, that was like, as long as you fit into one of these boxes, you can kind of be the other one. And the idea of like transsexuality, transgender, you know, genderqueer, things like that, really go back as far as human history, and cultures have usually had some way of dealing with it, various levels of good or bad.
Any other questions? No questions about the donkeys. What the? Or the camels, I mean. I dropped that. I softballed that question in there, and nobody. I'm very disappointed.
I have a story. I have a better story.
I meant camels, sorry.
So what's a pony show?
I have no idea. It's not Victorian.
I think it is.
So these days, sex toys are about as hidden in commerce as pornography would be, maybe a bit more. Back then, would you have dedicated shops hidden in basements? Would you have massagers?
No, you would go to your pharmacist and you could buy Ben 1 balls, you could buy dildos, you could buy vibrators, but they were for medicinal use only. And I believe they still are. Okay. Yes,
Right.
like weed. So it was very easy to find them. You even found different massage oils that had flavors, but again, all this stuff was coached as medicinal. So you could buy it, but you would have to go to your creepy pharmacist to buy it.
Could you buy medicinal strap-ons?
The strap-on has a fascinating history, and it is also Victorian. And what is interesting about the strap-on is it was also considered a medical device for individuals, particularly men, who were injured in war, and they needed to pleasure women usually, but and so that was what.
Oh, I thought it was for them.
Yeah, wait.
No. It's a strap-on. But what's fascinating about it is when you look at the Victorian strap-on, it has a little device in it, and you'll have to use your own imagination for it, which doesn't seem to exactly be useful for men.
Oh, a fieldo.
So, but the strap-on was available, and again, it was a medicinal or a medical device, like a hook hand. You know.
But wait, that makes no sense, because I thought Victorian women were not experiencing pleasure in sex at all.
No, they need it because if your wife had female hysteria.
Oh, okay, yes. Medicinal purposes, of course.
Again,
dingling.
Right.
Yes, not everyone could afford a dingler. You know, it was a campaign, I think, promised in 1864, you know, a dingler in every home.
Now, was this school revolution, mini revolution, was it mirrored in America, or did it have to come a little afterwards?
Which revolution?
This, like, dinglers, all this awesome stuff.
This was all simultaneously, for the most part. American and British culture and French culture, you know, the can comes over within probably, what, 5-6 years.
Oh, less than that.
You know, the Hess machine is actually a German invention, but it's already being used in America by 1893, and I think it gets invented around 1890, 1889. So there's a lot of communication across the pond.
And as you can guess, that kind of news traveled fairly quickly. They even had the telegraph by then. I mean, come on.
There's a whole interesting thing about obscene telegraphs.
I didn't think we were putting that in the book, but...
I think, did I put in a thing about Valentine's?
Oh!
Valentine's Day! Oh, how romantic.
Wonderful.
Valentine's Day.
Does anyone know the story?
Anybody know some of the interesting Victorian Valentine stuff? Yes?
I don't know any of the interesting Victorian stuff, but the story behind Valentine's Day is that wasn't it St. Valentine got these two lovers together and the family said, fuck no, you guys can't do that shit.
It must have occurred before 1834, so I don't know. You know Valentine's stuff. You look like a romantic. Tell us.
St. Valentine was a martyr who was executed by the Romans, but there were vinegar Valentines at that time.
Yes.
Yes.
They made like really sarcastic.
Oh yeah, not only sarcastic, sometimes just outright pornographic. Valentine's Day was outlawed through most of the Victorian age by the postmasters of both America and England because you would send such great Valentines
nasty postcards
with nasty pictures, and there were also love Valentines, but you didn't know when you were getting this little red envelope, is it going to be a nasty or a vinegar Valentine, or is it going to be a sweet or what they called a candy Valentine? There's some great ones. You can look up vinegar Valentines, and they're kind of funny. Some are just grotesque, but some are pretty funny.
Camels.
And some are both.
I actually wanted to, about steampunk and sex, like the contemporary culture. Has anyone read this recent article that came out from a satire website about how if you want your child to stay a virgin, get them into steampunk? So if you want to be very entertained and see something that's very wrong, read this website. It's humorous, you know, it's sort of an Onion style thing, claiming that if you want your kid to never have sex, make sure they are very into steampunk. And the thing that is really amusing to me is clearly that person has never been to a convention. The person who wrote that.
Now, most of these devices being sold for a medical purpose, were they made by medical manufacturers, or were they mostly made out of glass, or what would they use at that time period?
It's a good question. This was made out of glass, and Hess actually started as a clock maker, but not the actual timepiece, the different little things that would go around on cuckoo clocks or little moving things. You know, being a medical doctor was a kind of much more fluid idea than it is today. So it's a good question. I don't know the answer, but I would think that most of this stuff, like the strap-on, oh, and the strap-on had one of them names, very strange, was called My Butler Owen. And I don't know what the history of that is. And an Owen, for a long time, in late Victorian age, was another, like how we used the word dick. It was a person's name, but it also meant something else. But it comes from My Butler Owen.
I love your Owen.